You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Into the Dark podcast. I'm your host, Payton Moreland. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for supporting, and thank you for continuing to listen week after week. It means more to me than you will ever know. Now, of course, just the usual, please like and share the podcast. Please leave reviews, comments, send it to someone who you think would like it. Just engage with it. Thank you. I hate asking, but I will continue to beg, okay? Let's jump into my 10 seconds. I have been going to the gym as of recently, and I just finished lay-bay literally 30 minutes ago. No. 0 out of 10 recommend. 0 out of 10 recommend. Don't do it. Don't do it. My legs are shaking. I literally had to hobble down the stairs, okay? Granted, I know I don't work out that much, but I don't know how I'm going to keep going. This is awful. Horrible. It does give you like a dopamine hit, though. I will say. Like, it actually works. What the haters say is true. If you move your body, you do feel a little better. And it's such... It is infuriating. Is that how I say that? It's so annoying. But it's true. Also, I just want to feel a little bit stronger because I'm feeling really weak lately. And I want to feel a little bit stronger, so that's why I'm moving my body. But that is all I have for my 10 seconds. Let's get straight into the episode. So it is great to have faith in something. And there are a lot of different kinds of faith that a person can have. It could mean believing in God, but you don't have to be religious to have faith. You can believe in yourself or in the people you love and trust, or in an institution that has meaning to you. But if you put your faith in the wrong person or the wrong thing, it can have disastrous consequences, like in today's story. And few people know that as well as the residents of Knutby, Sweden. Now, Knutby is a small town about an hour north of the capital city of Stockholm. It's so small, in fact, that a lot of newspaper articles actually refer to it as a village. And Knutby is home to a small but thriving Pentecostal community. It's actually very well known for its churches. And that reputation goes back decades, okay? During the 1990s, a church called Knutby, Philadelphia, almost doubled in size. It went from having 60 people to 100 people, which was a huge amount of growth considering how small and remote Knutby village really was. And up until 2004, it was the sort of community where people felt safe. Religion was extremely important. But in 2004, that year, early on the morning of January 10th, before the sun had even come up, someone called the police to report a gruesome crime. A Knutby resident had been shot in his bedroom, not too far from the doorway. It seemed like he'd been asleep, only for something to draw him from his bed and into the line of fire. His name was Daniel Linda, and he was still alive when this call came in, but he needed medical treatment right away. He had been shot in the face, chest, and neck. Any of his injuries had the potential to turn deadly before long. Now, when the paramedics got there, they loaded Daniel up into an ambulance. Interestingly enough, there was another man at the crime scene by now. His name was Helge Fossmo, and he was Daniel's next-door neighbor and also the pastor of his church. Helge and Daniel were both part of the congregation I mentioned earlier, the church that doubled in size, Knutby, Philadelphia. And it seemed very clear that Helge cared about Daniel. He actually rode with him in the ambulance. Now, while Daniel was getting treatment, the police began surveying the scene, trying to figure out who could have done this. And as they investigated, they found something that was both completely unexpected and completely chilling. And that was actually at the neighbor's house, where Helge, the pastor, lived. He and his wife, Alexandra, slept in separate bedrooms. And when the police went over to check in on Alexandra because Helge had gone in the ambulance with Daniel, they found her dead. She had been shot in the head in her sleep with what appeared to be the same gun that had injured her neighbor, Daniel. So, of course, at this point, police are like, what is going on? They have so many questions for Helge. How could he have failed to notice that his wife had been murdered only to just happen to show up at the crime scene where a second victim had been shot? But when the police questioned him, he had a reasonable explanation. He said he was a very heavy sleeper, and since he and his wife didn't share a bedroom, she was shot in her own room, it just was impossible for him to hear the murder. And then when he had woken up and learned that another member of the congregation had been shot, he hadn't even thought to check in on his wife before running out the door to his neighbor's house. And he seems to be devastated. He's like, this is just horrible. They murdered my wife and my neighbor. This is just an unexpected tragedy. But the good news was that at the hospital, Daniel did end up pulling through. The bullet had shattered his jaw and blown apart 4 of his teeth, but it hadn't taken his life, so he was a survivor. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to identify the person who had shot him, so the police couldn't rely on his testimony. But then, a break came from an unexpected direction. See, on January 11th, this is just one day after the shootings, a 27-year-old woman named Sarah Svensson came to the police department, and Sarah said, I need to give a voluntary confession. Sarah comes in and tells the police she was the one who had killed Alexandra and injured Daniel. And she also claimed that she had come up with the idea to attack the both of them on her own. So Sarah goes in to this police station in this very religious community and says, God told me to do this. He sent me a series of text messages. Now, even more shocking is police look, and these texts actually existed. Sarah had hundreds, maybe even thousands of messages on her phone, all from a conversation with God, or a contact named God. This person said that they were angry at Sarah because she had done something very sinful, something that was incredibly difficult to forget. However, God was going to give her a chance to make things right and to earn her salvation again. All she had to do was kill 2 people, namely Alexandra and Daniel, the pair that she claimed she would go on to shoot. Now, it was clear to the investigators that Sarah really believed that she had been speaking with some kind of divine being or texting. She committed the murder because she had been ordered to over these texts, not because she wanted to. In fact, in those messages, she's argued with the person who had been texting her, who she thinks is God. She'd said that she didn't want to hurt anyone, and she certainly didn't want to be a killer. But the message sender had been insistent. They'd said that if Sarah wanted to be a good person and eventually get into heaven, she had to commit these murders because her soul was at stake. So even the police knew now that Sarah was probably the person who had actually pulled the trigger. I mean, she comes in with all of these old text messages on her phone. She's voluntarily confessing. But they need to keep investigating because they do not believe that God is on the other end of these texts. And they need to find out who told her to do this. And they had a couple leads. All they had to do was look at what the victims and Sarah had in common. Now, there's one very obvious one. Sarah had attended the Knutby, Philadelphia church. This is the same exact church where Helge was a pastor, and the same church that Daniel had attended with his wife and with Helge's wife. Sarah had been very involved with the congregation ever since she'd first moved to Canoi back in 1999. And then afterward, she had risen through the ranks rather quickly at this church. It seemed like she worked hard, and the other members of the congregation loved her. So they kept giving her more responsibilities and more authority. And remember, this church is basically the social life of this place. Now, at one point, Sarah was the second most powerful woman in the entire congregation. The only woman who outranked her was one of the pastors named Osa Valdo. So for a while, Sarah seemed to have it all. She was liked and respected, and she actually married another congregation member pretty soon after moving here and joining the church. And on top of that, the pastor, Helge, seemed to have a soft spot for Sarah. He especially felt for her when her marriage began crumbling around 2001. It was pretty early on. She was going through a nasty divorce, and she was also struggling to hold down a job at the same time. So now that Sarah was single, alone, and unemployed, Helge, the pastor, called some different contacts and helped her find a new job. She picked up odd gigs here and there, and then eventually she got an offer that was a very good fit for her. She became a nanny. Can you guess to whose children? Helge's. Basically, her pastor reached out to her one day to say that she could live in his home, help him raise his children, and she would make good money doing it. Which meant that there was a very strong connection between Sarah, Helge, and his wife Alexandra, who had been murdered. They had been friends, fellow congregation members, employers and employees, and they all lived together. But everything had fallen apart sometime in late 2002 or early 2003. Okay, this is roughly a year before the murder. Allegedly, Sarah had tried to attack Alexandra with a hammer, and Alexandra managed to escape unharmed. But Sarah was kicked out of the church entirely, obviously kicked out of the house, lost her job as the nanny. And honestly, it seemed like eerie foreshadowing for what was to come. Now, she had failed to kill Alexandra once, but we know she would come back to try again. And the next time in January of 2004, she'd succeeded. But even with that revelation, the police still don't quite understand this story. They didn't understand the why of it all. Who hated Alexandra so much that they had urged Sarah to make attempts on her life? However, the investigators did have a key clue on top of Sarah's confession, and that was her phone. Now, Sweden doesn't have the same privacy laws that we have in the United States, so it was very easy for them to look through her messages and learn everything about Sarah's life. It took them no time at all to identify the phone number that God was using to text her. Any guesses? Any? 3, 2, 1. Helge the pastor. Now, Helge had been sending those texts from his main phone number. He had used a secret second line, one that Sarah didn't know about, but it was easy enough for police to track. The entire time that he was tricking Sarah into thinking he was God, he had also been communicating with her as himself, which made sense because she was a friend and the nanny of his children at the time, so they did need to be in touch. Except when the police looked at the exchanges between Helge and Sarah, they found that they'd been talking way more than you usually would with a coworker. They'd texted more than 2,000 times from mid-November to January alone. 2,000 texts in about 2 months. And when police dig into these texts, the nature of these messages were romantic. Helge had clearly been having an affair with Sarah, the woman who had just come in and confessed to murdering his wife. So it had begun right around the time that Sarah actually came to live and work with him as a nanny. Apparently, the new job had coincided with a time when Helge became very sick with a mysterious illness. And according to him, demons had made him ill. They were attacking him because he was just so holy and such a good Christian. Now, Helge had told Sarah that she was the only person who could help him battle the forces of hell. Specifically, she could serve God and oppose evil by having sex with Helge. And then, when she had moved into his house, she also moved into his bedroom. Now, as I mentioned before, Helge's wife, Alexandra, slept in a separate room, and that's because her husband, Helge, literally kicked her out of their former room so that Sarah could come in and sleep with him every night. And I want to make this obvious that it doesn't seem like he was hiding this affair from his wife. But he still told Sarah that he wished he could be with her openly and live with her as husband and wife in front of everyone else. But in his position as a church leader, he was not allowed to get a divorce. Oddly enough, while his religion banned divorce, it was apparently okay with adultery, or at least it was okay with men who committed adultery, because around 2001, the news of their affair became public. I'm not sure how the secret got out, but suddenly everyone at Knutby, Philadelphia church knew that Helge, their pastor, was cheating on Alexandra, his wife, with Sarah, the nanny. And who did the congregation blame? Sarah. Pretty much everyone saw her as this evil woman who had moved in and broken up a marriage. So Sarah was forced out of her position and her authority. It all ended with her becoming an outcast within the church community. And then again, she was kicked out of the church entirely after the incident where she attacked Alexandra with the hammer. Now, meanwhile, the people of Knutby, Philadelphia, treated Helge like he was just a blameless victim of Sarah's seduction, which is a very unfair way of looking at things. The double standard aside, according to Sarah, she did not fully consent to her affair with Helge. Apparently, she only got together with him in the first place because the other pastor, the woman, had told her to. Supposedly, there was some kind of divine mission that the two of them were meant to achieve, and it required Sarah and Helge to sleep together. And then once Sarah was living with Helge and having sex with him, he made all the calls. He controlled her finances. He controlled her housing. He allegedly refused to let her leave, except a lot of the time she didn't want to believe. I mean, again, Sarah believed that God wanted her to be with Helge. This was her pastor. As she put it, quote, "Helge's word was my law, and by the grace of God, I had to be his slave." That's a direct quote. Now, Helge had his own choice words to describe his relationship with Sarah. He said that while they were together, quote, "Sarah became less and less Sarah and more of a shadow." So basically, allegations said that Sarah was in a very unfair situation while Helge had come out on top. He still got to be respected as a church leader, and he got to cheat on his wife without getting judged for it. But apparently, that wasn't enough for him. He wanted more. He wanted Sarah to murder his wife so he could get out of his marriage without having to go through a divorce process. But remember, when Helge sent Sarah those texts ordering her to commit the murder, he didn't only tell her to attack Alexandra. He wanted her to kill the next door neighbor, Daniel, too. So there's a whole other part to this. And his motive, once again, police learned, came down to an affair. Helge had also been cheating on his wife, Alexandra, with Daniel's wife. Also, this isn't necessarily relevant to the investigation, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Daniel's wife, aka Helge's second mistress, was related to Helge by marriage. You may remember the female pastor I mentioned earlier, Osa. Well, Daniel was married to her husband's sister, and Helge's wife was Osa's sister. So to summarize, he was married to the other pastor's sister, cheating on her with the other pastor's sister-in-law, all while running a church with her on top of it. There are also reports that at one time Helge and the other pastor were sexually involved with each other too. So on top of the fact that everyone lived next to each other, were going to the same church and had basically positions of power, they were all sleeping with one another, and they all were kind of related. So anyway, it was looking like Daniel had basically pretended to be God in order to manipulate Sarah into killing his wife and his other mistress's husband all in one go, which would have been shocking if not for the fact that Helge apparently had a history of deadly violence against his spouses. But to be clear, there actually is a lot of controversy around that claim and Helge's past, and many allegations haven't been proven, but it is still worth mentioning that Alexandra was not Helge's first wife. Before their marriage, Helge had been with a woman named Helene, and they were married in 1994 and stayed together for 5 years. In December of 1999, Helene allegedly slipped in the shower, fell and hit her head, and died. Except during her autopsy, the coroner thought that her head wound was not consistent with falling to the ground. And even more alarming, her toxicology reports showed a fatal dose of cough medicine in her system. So to be clear, she would have needed to take a lot of the medication to overdose on it. And interestingly enough, there were no traces of the drug in her stomach or digestive tract, meaning she hadn't swallowed it. So the police believed someone had dosed her with the fatal poison by shoving it into another orifice, and her killer may have struck her on the head in the process. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Helene's death, the police had just one suspect, and that was her husband, Helge. It didn't help that he married his second wife, Alexandra, just 9 months after Helene had passed. And it's also worth mentioning that by this time, Helge was 27 years old, while Alexandra, his second wife who would go on to be murdered by his mistress, well, one of them, was just 20 years old. Except there wasn't enough evidence at the time to charge him with anything or even to rule his first wife's death a murder. Still, fast forward to now the second wife's death, the investigators kind of remember the suspicion, and 5 years later, they begin to see the pattern. And there's one other detail that wasn't a smoking gun in its own right in this case, but it is still very incriminating. You'll remember that Helge claimed that he was asleep when Sarah shot and killed his wife, Alexandra. Now, according to him, he dozed right through the gunshots, which honestly seemed impossible to police. No matter how heavy of a sleeper you are, no matter if you're in another bedroom, you will hear a gunshot right down the hallway. So after the investigators had gathered the text messages, the suspicious details around Helene's death, and Sarah's outright confession, they arrested Helge. And once that happened, it was like the floodgates opened in this town. Before this point, the police had been having difficulties getting anyone from Knutby, Philadelphia church to talk on the record. But now, the people of the church seemed a lot more willing to talk openly. It appeared that they lost their faith in their pastor, Helge. Not only because he was apparently a murderer, but also they already knew he had been cheating on his wife. Remember, they seemed okay with it before, but now that they knew that Daniel's wife was in the mix as well and he had been having an affair with her, it was harder to paint Helge as an innocent man who had simply been tempted by evil women. Instead, it was becoming clear that the consistent problem across the board was Pastor Helge himself. It also seemed that some people were almost more bothered by the affair than by the homicide. Now, multiple church members were coming forward to the police, and they helped fill in the gaps that the investigators hadn't known before, particularly about how another pastor at Knutby, Philadelphia, Osa, might have played into all of this. Osa had been working for the church since 1992, and interestingly enough, she lived right next door to Helge. So his neighbor on one side was Daniel and his wife, who he would end up having an affair with. And then on the other side were his co-pastor, Osa, and her husband. Now, almost everyone who met this female pastor said she was beautiful, she was very charismatic, she was a great preacher. And a lot of people gave her the credit for helping the congregation grow so rapidly. The people of Knutby just wanted to be in church hearing what she had to say. Except the things she preached were out of step with mainstream Pentecostalism. Osa was obsessed with the end of times, and she believed that the apocalypse was going to come any day now. She also believed that the tiny town of Knutby was going to play a key role in the end times. Like God had personally handpicked this tiny town in the middle of nowhere to be especially important. Osa's beliefs were so extreme that other Pentecostal groups had distanced themselves from her and from Knutby, Philadelphia. In spite of that, she thought it was very important for her congregation to act a certain way, and they did exactly what she asked. After all, this female preacher was preaching that she was married to Jesus. Around town, she had a nickname, the Bride of Christ. And in her mind, that meant she understood better than anyone else how to follow God's will. So she told the people who they were allowed to date, who they were allowed to marry. You'll remember how earlier I mentioned that the Manny-turned-shooter, Sarah, went through a divorce. It was around the time that her affair with Helge began, and according to Sarah, she had only married her husband because Åsa had ordered her to. The reason the marriage had failed was because the two of them had never actually been in love in the first place. And then afterward, Åsa forced Sarah to get together with Helge, remember? Now, this female pastor denied those allegations, but the other people at Knutby, Philadelphia said this was exactly the kind of thing she would force people to do in the church. She seemed almost obsessed with other people's love lives and sex lives, and with dictating who could pair off with whom. Åsa even told people how to decorate their homes, how to dress. She micromanaged every detail of her congregation's lives. So, of course, some people have wondered how involved she may have been with the murder. There were rumors going around that Helge had been planning to run away with one of his mistresses, and if the gossip was to be believed, Åsa, the female pastor, couldn't handle the thought of anyone defying her or leaving her. The story went that she killed Alexandra, her own sister, just to punish Helge and to guarantee that he'd never defy her again. Now, one of the biggest proponents of that theory was Helge himself. In an interview, he said that he actually blamed her for both of his wives' deaths. So far as Helene, the first wife, went, Helge said it was possible that she could have taken her own life, but he argued that it was just as possible that Åsa had either murdered Helene or sent someone else from the church to do it for her. And as for his second wife, Alexandra's murder, Helge claimed that Åsa was the one who had written all of those texts from God. It wasn't him. That she'd sent them to him and then ordered him to forward them to Sarah. He only did what she said because he was afraid of what she might do if he didn't. So basically, he's like, yeah. Okay, I did send the God messages to Sarah, but I had no choice and I wasn't writing them. Now, I know this is something we see a lot. If someone is suspected in a murder, they will often find a way to deflect blame and say someone else was responsible, even responsible for their part in the murder. But I do have to acknowledge, there were certainly signs that the whole plot was much bigger than what the police had already uncovered. It began with some holes in the confession Sarah gave to police at the beginning of this story. See, Sarah claimed that on the morning of January 10th, she began by killing Alexandra. She said she did it alone and with no one's help because God had told her to via text message. She shot Alexandra twice in her bed while she was asleep, and then she walked into the next house over and broke into Daniel's home. Sarah made it all the way to his bedroom, but couldn't go any further because his bedroom door was locked, so her next move was just to knock. And when Daniel got out of bed and answered, she shot him in the face, chest, and neck. Now that is consistent with the ballistics evidence, which showed that both Alexandra and Daniel were shot at point blank range. Here's the problem though. When Sarah gave her confession, the police also asked her to reenact the shootings, and they filmed it. The idea was for her to show where and how she shot each victim, how she'd held the gun, what angle she was standing at, and just everything else. But in the reenactment, the details did not match up. She was much farther away from Alexandra than she should have been when she claimed she pulled the trigger. And a few times when she got a detail completely wrong, the police told her what to do differently and then had her do a second take for the reenactment. They're like, no, that's not possible. You need to do it like this. And then she would redo it. So it seemed like she almost needed to be coached in order to accurately describe the shootings. And that fact alone had a lot of people thinking that maybe Sarah was not the real killer. And if she wasn't responsible, that also meant the text Helge sent her about God wanting her to kill might not have been the smoking gun that the police wanted them to be. I do have to acknowledge that Helge also blamed another member of the congregation. He never gave the person's name, but he said that a particular man had been present at the scene when both Helene and Alexandra had died, and that guy might have been the real killer, not him or Sarah. It's hard to know how seriously to take his claims and how many of them were an attempt on his part to find someone else to blame for his actions. But here's what I do know. Sarah and Helge both went to trial later that year, and they were both found guilty of killing Alexandra and shooting Daniel. Now, by this point, it was pretty clear to the courts that Sarah had serious mental health issues. She probably wouldn't have believed those texts were actually from God otherwise. So rather than send her to jail, the judge sentenced her to stay in a mental health facility, and she would be released when she was no longer a danger to herself or anyone else. And Helge's sentence was life in prison. Well, in 2011, Sarah was let go. Apparently, she was in a better place mentally and emotionally. So even though she'd only been locked up for 7 years, that was all the time she'd ever served for the deadly shooting. And as for Helge, originally he was not supposed to be eligible for parole, but in 2014, he caught a break. The courts decided that he could, in fact, be eligible for parole after just 16 years. So that would be in 2020. Now, the reasoning was that the risk of Helge reoffending was low, and if he didn't pose a danger to anyone else, there was no reason to keep him locked up, which was a surprising conclusion for the courts to reach, in my opinion, because so many people thought that Helge had also killed Helene, like this was a pattern. If he had murdered 2 wives already, it was hard to accept that he posed no danger to anyone else. Except Helge still hasn't been convicted of Helene's murder. The police did reopen the investigation into her death after Alexandra's homicide, but the second time around, they still didn't have enough evidence to prove that he was guilty. So technically, he's only convicted of 1 murder and 1 attempted murder. Anyway, Helge was eligible for parole in 2020, but when he asked to be released, the courts rejected it. He sat in prison for 2 more years until 2022. And that time around, he was let go. So Helge is now living as a free man. He has changed his name and is married to a 3rd wife, someone he met while he was in prison through a letter exchange program. Now, in a recent interview with the press, he said this about his current wife. She is a fantastic woman, a person I get along very well with. And for the sake of her well-being, I hope they are still getting along well. Now, as I wrap things up, I will note that one of the biggest questions in this case is about whether justice was served. Did the courts get it right in terms of who they charged and how much time Helge and Sarah spent behind bars? And the answer really depends on who you ask. Some people believe that Helge was a manipulative, violent murderer who tricked Sarah into killing for him, all because he didn't want to go through a divorce. And if that is the case, it's right to send him to prison. But his sentence may have been too short. Others think that even though he served time for his crimes against Alexandra and Daniel, he still managed to get away with killing his first wife, Helene. So again, maybe his sentence should have been longer or he shouldn't have been paroled. And some people think that he was actually a victim in all of this. Those people argue that the other pastor, the female pastor, should have been prosecuted as well, because she could have manipulated Helge, Sarah, or the both of them into committing the crimes, considering her history of manipulation in the church. Now, I will note that in 2020, Osa was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault against her congregation. She was sentenced to 120 hours of community service, but again, she hasn't been charged with anything related to the murders or even formally investigated for them. So the details of this case may be messy, and that's all before we get into the complicated, controversial conversation around mental health and how it played into Sarah's actions. We might never learn exactly where the truth lies and who was or wasn't at fault. Ultimately, It all comes down to what you believe and where you choose to put your faith. And that is today's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you next week as we go further into the dark together. Goodbye.